Hello and welcome to Mother Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Poppy Coburn, back for the second time on MMM. Poppy is the assistant comment editor at the Telegraph. We spoke today about Rotherham in a macro-political sense, what the scandal means for the legitimacy of the British government, comparisons with the Catholic sex abuse scandal, the role of British media in not covering it adequately, and generally what this scandal means for British politics in the coming years. The extended version of the episode can be found at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the last episode I recorded with Poppy on the Zoomer right. I think that was a bit over a year ago. All of the other extended versions of all of the episodes, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and the MMM chat community, which is growing day by day. So, Poppy, we're talking, a week after the parliamentary vote on whether or not to hold a national inquiry into grooming gangs.
Yeah.
And it seems as if it's sort of slipping out of the news cycle.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some Labour MPs who have now changed their position on the inquiry question, and Reform are, particularly Rupert Lowe, are continuing to push it, but it doesn't feel sort of as urgent, right, in terms of the pressure that Musk and others are putting on the government via Twitter. I don't think it's going away, though. This scandal poses such a fundamental threat to the worldview of this government, and indeed of many parliamentarians, not just in Labour, that I think it can't go away. I think it's going to continue to plague them.
I completely agree with you. And, let's say that, the next couple of weeks, months, the typical news cycle, it moves on. Maybe you get one or two op-eds. Maybe Elon Musk tweets about it again. Maybe even another Labour MP comes out and says, there's something dodgy going on here. We should have an investigation. Let's have an inquiry. The point is, and, I tried to get this across to people who have been really confused about why grooming gangs became back in the news, seemingly from nothing, is this actually isn't like a historical event. This isn't like a historic case of a horrific group crime that was covered up with the knowledge of local authorities, but that was done 10, 15, 20 years ago, and it's a horrific scandal. But at the end of the day, it's like the infected blood scandal or something. It's rumbling along, but it's not like an urgent, pressing alarm that's having real impacts in communities across the United Kingdom. Well, that's not true. It's still happening. This is the fundamental point about the grooming gang scandal for people to understand, and why Labour cannot ignore it. And I do believe they kind of know that. And they're just frightened because of the implications of what will come from having to act. It is continuing. It is still happening across the country. If you speak to anyone who works in social services in some of these areas, but really all across the UK, somebody will have some sort of story, or they'll have heard a whisper, or they'll raise some sort of concern and go, yeah, I think it's still happening. It's still going on. And we know that's true even from just the prosecution record. What people bring up, the Andrew Norfolk investigation for the Times came out in 2014. There was a moment of kind of national grief and outrage. Grooming gangs were still operating then. They operated long after that, and they are still operating now. So I think, even if it feels like the news has dipped a little bit, there's still got to be the roiling tension and the anger and the sense of betrayal that will not go away, because there's an understanding now that because it's come up again and the lines have been drawn more, I think, in 2014 when it hit the national press, everybody was kind of on one side, at least publicly. They said, this is awful, something must happen. Let's just wait for it to fall out of the news, if you didn't want anything really done. Or let's just commission an inquiry, which is what the government does when they don't want to do anything, and hope it goes away. In this case, I think it's now, the stakes are much higher in the conversation. The establishment is much more afraid of public unrest. So you now actually see people coming out trying to deny the reality of what was happening in these grooming gangs. You're now seeing it split more along political lines as well. And that tells me that this issue is still very much like a live wire and could, kind of heat up again at any moment. And that's really, really dangerous for the government. I think they know that.
The difference, I think, between this scandal and, say, the infected blood scandal or Hillsborough or the post office scandal or any of these other things you want to list, or even, say, Jimmy Savile, right, which is more similar in terms of being sexual abuse, is that none of them undermined a central idea within the political establishment, like diversity is our strength. Because actually, I mean, this is why I think that the genealogy on Twitter as to why Rotherham kind of reemerged in the discourse and why Elon noticed it is because Fraser Nelson wrote something for the Telegraph. I think it was in the Telegraph. Yes,
it was. It was his
your
last
paper.
column.
Yeah, before we went to the Times, about how multiculturalism, mass immigration had been a great success in Britain, which Fraser sort of often expounds this view. And he got piled on Twitter, as he always does every time he writes this column. And someone responded saying, like, grooming gangs is the great challenge to that view, Fraser.
Yeah.
And then included screenshots, the now infamous screenshots from this Oxford case in the sentencing remarks. And I think that's true. It is the great challenge. And the problem is, of course, that, I mean, particularly if you are in London and other parts of the UK, diversity is our strength is practically painted on the walls.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It's in every school curriculum. It's promoted in, children's TV. It's basically done up in fireworks and at the London New Year's fireworks. Do you know what I mean? Like it's so central to politics. And to say actually diversity is not our strength, or diversity, even to say that diversity is like neutral, is an enormous challenge. And I think that's why grooming gangs is much, much more threatening than any other scandal that I can think of in living memory.
I think the better analogy to use, and like we've kind of discussed this before, is it's not like just Jimmy Savile. It's more like the Catholic Church's child sex abuse scandal in Ireland specifically.
Yes.
And so it's like there's state involvement, there's institutional cover-up, there's this horrific scale of the crime.
Over a long period of time.
Over a very long period of time. And I think that is the only example I can think of that actually fits well onto it. And also coming back to what you said about the kind of diversity is our strength, it is the state religion in the same way that the Catholic Church, was the foundation for growing up as a young person in Ireland, particularly then in the latter half of the 20th century, that is so integral to what you are learning at school, to what you are, obviously learning in church, from what you're learning from your parents. It is just like this miasma in the air around you. To then see that seemingly repudiated, but in the most horrific form. I mean, I know this is true for me and a few other young right-wing people in Britain. The reason why they kind of became right-wing, even though it's quite uncommon to be right-wing and young, is...
Well, I don't know if the polling on reform support might, but anyway,
well, there you go. I mean, I think we're moving more towards that, but it was grooming gangs. I mean, this was literally, I think the first long-form piece of writing I did was about the experience of my mum, who works quite closely with social care. She used to work at a behavioural unit and was very aware of the grooming gang scandal, and she sat me down and she made us watch a BBC documentary about it that came out. And I remember being whoa. And I kind of read about it online, and the more you read about it, the more you were this is so gigantic, this is so massive, and this is so against everything I've been taught by everyone around me. It's such a glaring refutation of that whole world view and mindset. And I was why is no one talking about this? Why is this not constantly in the front page of the news? Why are politicians not being censored for this? Why are we not sending people not just the perpetrators, but people involved in the cover-up to jail? Why is this being treated as just another day, another tragic, very sad, moving on? And I think the more the knowledge of the grooming gangs gets out, particularly to a kind of young and more politically sticky, more movable generation of people, the more it's going to be like, the blinds lifting from your eyes, and you're like, hang on, this is complete rubbish. This is like, this can't possibly be true. If this is true, then everything I've been taught by the authority figures around me is a lie. And it's not an untruth, it's a lie, it's a conscious lie. And that's why it's so dangerous. And that's why people are so desperate to like shut the conversation down or redirect it into something else. Because the awful like core truth at the center of the scandal is so antithetical to the regime that like we live in today. It is so against the very moral core or the foundation of the society we like all live in and contribute to, that it's really dangerous. It is genuinely really dangerous.
And I think we only know a fraction of it. And that's why having the national inquiry, I initially, to be honest, thought when people started pushing for a national inquiry, I sort of thought, oh, bloody hell, we've already had a bunch of inquiries. Like, can we not please just start like hanging the rapists already? But then, of course, that's never going to happen. Well, that's not currently within the Overton window. But I actually think a national inquiry is the right thing to be pushing for, not least because actually I think so we know that this is not exclusively a phenomenon of Pakistani perpetrators, right? I think there have been, I think that there were some Somali gangs in Bristol. And yes, and I think there have possibly been some Arab. I mean, Islam is kind of the uniting factor, but this is across different groups. But nonetheless, it's predominantly Pakistani. Partly, I think, largely, I think, because Pakistanis form the largest proportion of Muslims in Britain. Like a third or something like that, maybe more. Places like Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Oldham, and Oxford that are commonly associated with grooming gangs, where we know about what happened and where there were arrests and inquiries to some extent. And so to some extent, this has been uncovered. They actually don't have a very high proportion of Pakistani. Like the Pakistani population in those places is not actually that high.
Oh yeah, and like
it's like a few percent.
At the time, it was like 1.5%.
Yeah. So it's not
in Rotherham were Pakistani.
Yeah, so it's not the case that these are massively Pakistani cities and towns at all. They're really not. The places actually in the UK which have the highest proportion and also absolute number are Birmingham and Bradford. And there have been no inquiries. And also mysteriously nothing coming out of these places. You hear whispers, right, of this going on there, but actually nothing kind of on the record. And I think that seems like an awfully big coincidence. A national inquiry would have to look at these places.
I mean, I desperately want like the sort of inquiry that I think we both have in mind. Okay, so like there needs to be more fact finding. There definitely needs to be like town by town investigations that are performed independently. But because like, I mean, I think as we both know, whenever the British State does an inquiry, like 9 times out of 10, the goal of the inquiry is to like make it go away. Particularly if it's something that is like this contentious, and this damaging to the regime. And what concerns me is that, like, as with all the previous cases, it will needlessly go on for several years, which will kind of suck any political will to act out of it. It will be conducted perhaps by not so independent like researchers. So like a lot of the researchers in the field, obviously the very brave whistleblowers excluded, may have some slightly ulterior motives, and not to name names, but there's some research that's come out about grooming gangs that has been extremely shoddy, and appears to have an ideological motivation.
Not least from the Home Office.
Well, not least from the Home Office. And I mean, my main thing is, like, let's have an inquiry. Let's have many, many inquiries on it, not just a national, but also more local. But I think it has to be part of like a broader platform, because I just worry that like whenever we diffuse things, and we kind of like slow the momentum and get granular, you run the risk of it being taken over by people who maybe don't have the best interests at heart, and they don't actually want to get to like the truth of what's really been going on here. And I think it is testament to the bravery of these whistleblowers But what really strikes you is like there's not many people that were brave enough to come forward. When these were cases, the known cases, like thousands of girls were raped, and there are only a few whistleblowers that we know of who actually like managed to really raise the alarm, and they faced some pretty horrific personal consequences for like speaking out. And so I almost feel like we need a bit of like a South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Like I think it has to have a sort of like real like, it's maybe even a better example is the COVID inquiry. Okay, like we had film cameras every day recording politicians who are being hauled in front of judges and ask about what their role was in dealing with the COVID scandal and whether or not they'd like screwed up or something. Why not do that in this instance? I think it's like transparency, 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 because the whole point of these cases is that like you kind of can't trust the people you're supposed to be able to trust. So why should we expect it's any different now? That's my main concern with the inquiry line, and I think that should be like the opening like negotiating position. Like not the be all and end all, because I think otherwise you're just going to get another J report, and I don't think that's far enough.
And it will take years.
And it will take years. It will take 5 years.
It's crazy, really, that Labour didn't just. I know that their argument with this bill last week was that it couldn't be included in the bill for technical reasons. But there's absolutely, you don't need primary legislation to hold an inquiry. All they had to do was just announce, it's cool, we'll do an inquiry. And actually that would have been a very, I think, a clever way of dealing with it, because you just push it down the track and hope that everyone forgets and soft pedal it. And the fact they haven't even done that, I think it's because they don't want to be seen to be pushed around by Elon Musk.
100%. Is that I genuinely I saw some people suggest that maybe it's like, oh wow, it must be so horrific that they don't want an inquiry. And I'm like, I think it is so horrific, but if people don't want to find stuff,
I think they realise that Labour councillors will be implicated as well, at minimum. And Labour MPs likely as well.
100% they will. But I think it's more like, will they actually make them independent? I don't know. But like also, there's this kind of pigheadishness to Starmer, where he just like, the idea of being seen to have been like galvanized by the online radical right and like foreign billionaires like Elon Musk, it's this kind of like slightly pathetic faux macho posturing of like, we won't be seen to be pushed around, and the slightly darker but probably equally valid explanation of it may upset some of their voting base, and a lot of their like senior MPs have razor thin margins. Anyone who was on the ground reporting in the 2024 election campaign can tell you the way that some Labour MPs were treated by these independent campaigns was pretty unbelievably shocking.
Not least Jess Phillips.
And I think even the fact that I think there are actually a lot of them are very frightened. They're so frightened that they won't even publicly say that they're afraid. But I know for a fact that it's much worse than people think it is. They are genuinely quite petrified. I mean, that's all the more reason for like the need for an independent look into all of this, because if our elected officials who are sitting in the Houses of Commons might feel that their constituents don't want an inquiry into child rape gangs, and they feel that they cannot do that for their own personal safety. I mean, come on, it's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. That's so, it is almost grounds for Donald Trump annexing us and turning us into the 51st state or something. It's just like,
well, 52nd if Greenland gets him first.
Well, yeah, it's just like, this is the behavior of like a failed state. It's just crazy. Like, why are people trying to downplay that? It's so humiliating and shocking.
I suppose precisely for that reason.
Yeah.
And also, I suppose, normalcy bias. I am so agitated about grooming gangs, listeners may have realised. Like, because I've cared about this for so long. And as with you, I had that radicalising moment of reading. I mean, I first encountered it like your mum at work, and then I looked into it in terms of what was available online and was bowled over, and have never stopped thinking about it. and then to suddenly see it blow up internationally and to see Britain through foreign eyes is kind of destabilizing.
It is. It's almost like the kind of weird, like, I think because a lot of people had like that radicalizing moment you talked about and then did loads of investigation, had a moment of like trying to like publicly raise the alarm as much as they could within like whatever world they worked in, and then like not seeing anything change. It almost became like Jeffrey Epstein in like 2018 or something, like before he died, when it was like you had this almost weird like underground network of people who knew the truth, but like there felt like there was this mercy on speaking about it, and what was kind of fascinating about the last couple of weeks is that you got this massive eruption of anger from people who who knew, and there were more people who knew the scale of the abuse than like I had thought was true, and it hasn't been forgotten. And again, I just feel like so much of, and we can't take this out of the context as well of the summer riots from
Yeah,
last year.
yeah. Which
That's
also happened
another
in Rotherham.
like one of the most violent like attacks happened, like clashes happened in Rotherham.
Yeah.
I think the response at the time of the government to those riots was very much the response of a leadership class that knew, oh, we actually like don't know how deep the scale of like the kind of ethnic tension is in our own country. We actually don't really have a particularly strong police force, or at least a police force that kind of knows how to deal with this if it becomes like a bigger problem than just a small isolated clash. And it's true, social media has changed the game, where people could look at, like, for example, what was going on in Hare Hills and Leeds, which is where there were like violent clashes with the police over some children that were taken from a Roma family, I think on charges of child abuse. And there was this big, like I think a bus was burned, whatever. And people saw like the police running away from those people. Then you had the Manchester airport scuffle, where you have like Ahmed Yaqub, who ran to be an independent politician, just missed out, has quite a big following in Birmingham, representing these men, one of whom now has charges for assaulting a female police officer. It becomes like a sort of mini George Floyd in the UK. It becomes like a racial issue. So people kind of had that in the back of their minds, and they're kind of primed to be like, this doesn't seem like properly harsh treatment by the police, or it feels like they're being cowed in some way. And then they see the riots, and they see the state really panicking and going, oh crap, this is really extreme. We kind of have lost control almost for a couple of days. I think the kind of fear that left in people in government's minds is very deep and very strong. And I don't think they're delusional enough to think it's going to fix itself on its own, but they also don't see a way out of that situation. You can paper over the cracks. You can continue telling yourself that Britain has an integration miracle, the areas in the north of England don't have ethnic tensions, or they're not essentially like entirely segregated, like massively segregated towns, where there is basically no positive interaction between peoples. That's not just white British, by the way. It's like all sorts of different like balkanized ethnic groups not interacting with each other in a positive way at all in towns across the UK. Like, that's not getting any better. It's getting worse. So why would you believe that these potential violent reprisals or these clashes are going to get better over time? No, like your brain obviously will tell you it's going to become more severe. So you have to have a heavy-handed response. You have to start like saying everything's disinformation. You have to start putting people in jail for tweets. Like, that is the only thing you can possibly do, because this is such a dangerous situation for you if you are in government. Like, because it's just like a tinderbox. Now, like that cannot continue. I just think it's in no way sustainable for us all to be tiptoeing around like incredibly uncomfortable, difficult, and in this case, like literal, like almost war crime level atrocities, because we're frightened of upsetting like racial tensions. I mean, I know that's what the British state has basically done since like Enoch Powell's speech. I mean, that was literally the response of, oh crap, we don't want this to happen. We're going to stop immigration into the country. We're obviously going to condemn what he said, but like, oh God, like this is frightening. We don't want clashes in the street. We don't want Brixton riots again. You know, we don't want the Notting Hill riots. Let's just like put it away, back of our mind, and not think about it. And we're still using that like tactics, these old-fashioned tactics that maybe kind of worked in the 1980s, but like so don't work in the 2020s.
Or worked in Empire.
Yeah,
That,
or
I
worked
mean,
in Empire, right?
yeah, that's not original to me, right? That insight that in some ways British policing is imitating the tactics of colonial policing
Yeah.
in terms of divide and rule, basically just prioritizing the prevention of rioting, not justice, and sort of squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of policies in terms of keeping certain groups happy if you're worried about them being violent. That's worked, like, I guess, moderately well in parts of Empire. It's been imported to the homeland.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. Well, I mean, you know, it has worked. I guess, to be fair to the British police force, we have actually not had much in the way of rioting. I mean, as Fraser Nelson has often pointed out, it's surprisingly infrequent actually to see race riots in Britain.
Work when like the numbers are small enough. I mean, also like something this, whenever people say, no, this is a frequent thing people say, but it is nice insight that some people have had, which is Britain has like a millet system.
Yeah.
And that's not quite right, because that would imply that like the white British population also like had a community representative or something. Like, no, it's like liberalism for some, but community relations for others. And I think as the demographic profile of the country changes, that's just not going to work anymore, because I think there's going to be that perception of two-tier policing that doesn't go away. And it's going to be increasingly problematic when like it hits areas that are outside of the north of England, who have had like a longer, steadier process of that sort of system. So like Bradford, for example. That was another interesting thing about the riots. Like it hit areas kind of all over the country in the end, which will tell you as well, this isn't just like something you can pin down to some certain like hyper racist communities existing throughout the UK, or like concentrated in certain towns. Like that's clearly not true, because it's there's roiling anger kind of across the country. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like, if I were Keir Starmer, you would just come to the conclusion that the only thing you can do is basically to become a bit of a Tin Pot dictator and start like creating a class of political prisoners. But like that's you know, he's an intelligent man. That is not a good solution if the problem is getting worse, which it is. I think you know, the tensions are going to get worse, not better. It will come to a point where it doesn't matter how many people you send to jail for saying like grooming gangs are a like Pakistani Muslim problem, in the wrong context, in the wrong social context. More and more people will feel that your government is in some way like illegitimate, or doesn't have like a right to do that, doesn't have a right to put people in jail for that. And yeah, I don't know how they'll actually respond when that moment comes. And I think it's probably closer than we think it is.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. I've heard some chatter from MPs about banning Twitter, because the leading theory is that the riots and indeed this resurgence in concern about grooming gangs are caused by misinformation on Twitter and on other platforms as well. And that's, and possibly if Elon Musk isn't responsible, then maybe even more sinister actors like Russia are responsible, right? And so I guess if that is your theory, then shutting down these platforms, I guess, is the only thing that you really have left to do. I share your. You sort of have to feel sorry for him, right? I share your confusion about what else Starmer can do in this situation to try and avert further violence.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just you're going to see like an increasingly like bizarre method of governance that comes from like leaning upon these like very historically contingent terms like disinformation and misinformation. And you'll see, I think, people increasingly sounding like total conspiracy nuts. Like, if you actually listen to how some of these like self-proclaimed like sensibles talk, they have this kind of like swivel-eyed, like lunatic demeanor when they're implying that like there's this sinister machinations of a global cabal of evil billionaires who are implanting these false, well, actually true, but in a bad context, stories about real things that have happened in the UK, as if like the UK public are like these kind of docile like animals who are just waiting for either like good information or bad information to be like shoved into their left ear.
Did you watch that BBC fact-checking thing about Musk's comments?
Yeah, I did. It's really funny.
Yeah, because so it is the case that he's exaggerating in some instances or getting things a bit wrong in some instances. The bit I remember from in particular from that video was that he had shared something about a list of MPs who had voted against deporting rapists to their countries of origin, and the BBC said, actually, these rapists were actually Jamaican. And they were this, and the MPs voted against deporting them because they wanted to see the Windrush scandal resolved. I.e., there was this scandal about. I mean, it's really pales in significance to the other scandal we're talking about here, but the
Like the
scandal was
Home
about.
Office lost some documents
So
and
some
then tried
people
to
had
falsely deport people.
who actually had a right to British citizenship
Yeah,
because they'd lived in the country long enough, but they'd never applied for
it's
passports,
like
and
it's like
so there was like a
a
weird.
yeah, it's literally like a administrative screw up, which is bad and obviously caused a lot of people distress. But it was
Yeah.
spoken about as if it was like the greatest civil rights injustice since like the Montgomery bus boycott. I mean, uh,
Yes, and was swiftly named the Windrush scandal right after
yeah,
the Empire Windrush boat. Yeah, so they had basically said, no, don't deport these criminals, some of whom were rapists, to Jamaica until we've checked whether they might actually have the right to British citizenship, which would mean we couldn't deport them. And I thought, I understand that what Musk has said was technically false in that he seemed to think that this was concerning grooming gangs when it wasn't. But I feel like he's directionally very much correct, and that actually that's not, you're not making it sound better.
but this like style of like Barack Obama liberalism, where you think you can win as if like life is a game and you can kind of win the game if you input the right like responses, and you're like,
Mm,
oh, like if you come to my independent fact checking website, the idea that there's this social force in politics of an independent truth. I mean, like that's
mm,
the whole point of politics, is that like people's idea of what is correct and true is different. Like that is why we
mm,
have politics. But these
mm,
people hate politics. They find it icky and distressing and difficult. And so they want to like drag everything out of the political sphere and into their own perception of what is like objective rational truth. And I think if when you like start to recognize the pattern of people doing this stuff, like and the UK is really bad for this, by the way. Like when Mark Zuckerberg said he's no longer going to have these fact-checking websites, it shamed me that like my countrymen were the people who created Full Fact and were the ones seemingly the most upset about their like little gotcha websites being no longer used by Facebook. But it really does come down to this like I don't think they have bad intentions necessarily, but they just miss the point. They entirely miss the point. Like there is no such thing as a fact checker. That is an entirely fake, historically contingent position that was born out of like an Obama era wonkishness to apply like the social science veneer to politics that then became more frantic and like more bizarre after Trump won and Brexit happened because people couldn't possibly consider that their political opinions were unpopular. And so it had to have been the work of like, Jin, like these evil far-right Jin who were like infecting people with their crazy ideas. And I think it's really important that like when this sort of stuff comes up, we call these people what they are, and we say like, you're anti-democratic, you don't trust the political process, you wouldn't be out of place in Putin's Russia. Like, this is not a liberal project at all. It's like bizarre. It's honestly bizarre. And particularly in the case of the grooming gangs, where missing forest for the trees. I mean, it is clearly in that case an attempt to muddy the waters somewhat, which I can't forgive. Like I can forgive being like an overly earnest kind of West Wing guy and thinking it's like a force for good. I cannot forgive people who are deliberately trying to complicate matters because it is so politically difficult for them to accept the reality of what these grooming gangs are, and are so trying to suggest that actually it's all a conspiracy theory by the far right, and if it weren't for Tommy Robinson and if it weren't for Elon Musk, everything would be hunky-dory and all fine and don't worry about it and shut up and go back to bed. Like that to me is like the most disgusting like response to all of this now. I just find it so repellent. Honestly, it's just awful.
It's a very funny sort of tick that you so often come across when people when Tommy Robinson's name comes up, where people say his name's actually Stephen Yaxley Lennon.
Yeah,
it's really
yeah.
peculiar. Like we don't dead name anyone else. Like Elton John
No.
doesn't get that treatment. It's always regarded as a sort of like gotcha, as if it wasn't universally known
it's
that
so
he
it's
has a
so
different
small
legal name.
scale, right? It's so petty. It's so petty, and I think like you can be petty when the stakes are like Westminster rigmarole, when it's like the cut and thrust of like insider political gossip. But if you are talking about mass child rape and your greater concern is like that we don't dead name Tommy Robinson, like I'm sorry, you're not a serious person. Like, I'm not listening to you. Like, you've clearly are like a morally suspect person if that is the thing that you think is more important. I just find these people to be. I find it bizarre that they don't see how repugnant this behavior is. I just find it baffling.
You compared this earlier with the Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal, which I think is a good comparison. Another parallel that I don't think we mentioned is the time frame. So the Catholic Church abuse scandal really, I think, was like late 90s, right? That it started picking up pace. And that was actually at the moment really when the influence of the church was faltering seriously.
Yeah.
This stuff doesn't come out at the peak of the power of whichever institution has enabled the abuse to go on. It comes out during its autumn, right? Or even its winter. And I think that is what we're seeing now. And I wrote a piece on Substack suggesting that actually Elon Musk, yes, is a very important figure in terms of the fact that he bought Twitter, the fact that he's now cottoned onto this issue and is going on about it, and I don't think he's going to drop it. But actually, I think if Musk had started talking about this even a year ago, certainly 2 years ago, it wouldn't have had the impact that it's had. I think that it's the cumulative. I mean, you talked about the riots following Southport, Manchester. I actually sat down when I was writing that and I tried to think. I brainstormed all of the events of the last 12 months, which have in some way undermined the diversity is our strength narrative, all the news stories. And actually there were so many, and there were so many I'd forgotten. And I'd actually forgotten about those riots in involving the Roma.
Oh, in How Hills.
The children be taken together. I'd forgotten about those. And that was, just before Manchester. There have been so many of these. And I think the idea that this is just the Russians have the easiest job in the world, right? If they're trying to upset people, and they probably are. I mean, I don't think it's implausible that Russia is using bots or whatever to try and
but it's also like you don't
create
even
social
need it,
unrest.
because you would
that's the
get that
thing.
impression
Yeah.
from like, I mean, again, the danger of Twitter to the government is you can read media news stories and it would just be a news story and it won't be editorialized. Let's say that's how you get your news. And it won't exist in like a broader context of stuff. I think the thing with social media is that you'll read it and then you'll be like talking to other people and being like, this isn't normal, and it doesn't fall out of your memory as easily. And so you start to kind of see the broader pattern of like kind of social decay and breakdown, rather than just like it's just one of many, many, many things happening that day. And by nature of the cycle of news, it kind of falls out of your head. Oh, plus it's a narrative violation, right? Because depending on where you get your news, you can kind of shut this stuff off. You can't really do that on a more decentralized, social media platform, especially if you use your For You tab. I'm sure Elon Musk is probably putting his foot on that to show more like right-leaning content, just because it performs well algorithmically, and he's a businessman at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But like that is certainly exposing a lot of people to stuff, like videos, like video proof of stuff that they would like otherwise wouldn't have ever seen. Yeah.
A friend of the pod, who I won't name just because I haven't asked her permission, but I'm sure she actually wouldn't mind. We were talking about the fact that British media coverage of child abuse of Rotherham, right? Generally, it was covered, right? Generally, I mean, not always. As Charlie Peters has said, he was the only reporter in the room in some sentencing events, right? But generally, it was covered. Generally, there were front pages of the Times. There were some investigations. When there were opinion pieces written, to be clear, they were mostly of this shouldn't be politicised by the far right, Tommy Robinson should stay out of this variety, okay? But there were some. So it wasn't like it was ignored per se, and people did know about it and the information was out there. What didn't happen though, and this is what my friend pointed out, is no one ever noticed with a capital N, right? In British media. There was never a piecing together of all the bits and imposing a narrative on it, which is done all the time in relation to other things. I was just reading this morning the long piece by Sophie Smith in the London Review of Books on the Pellico case, Giselle Pellico, the woman who was drugged and abused by her husband and lots of other men. And immediately coverage of that piece is slotting it into larger narratives. And you're seeing lots of editorializing, lots of opinion writing, saying this says something about France, this says something about patriarchy, this says something about pornography, whatever
which will
it is,
also
right?
be seen across the political spectrum as well. Particularly on a case like that, or even something like Me Too, for example, which was a massive, massive, massive media thing. And you saw people from the left, the right, and the centre all pontificating on it for a very long time and making things out of it. With a relatively there are obviously some people who had different perspectives. I know you wrote about it a lot, unlike others, but there was generally one received opinion that people were kind of repeating back at each other. You're completely right. The grooming gang stuff is really tricky, because when you have a conversation with people about it, they can say things like, it was reported, and it was, and there has been some fantastic investigation work being done. I won't fault the people who actually went out there and spoke to the victims and got it in the news, obviously. But
And Andrew Norfolk, sorry to interrupt, but Andrew Norfolk, who's the key person, right,
Yeah,
in doing these investigations for the Times, he said at the time, he said since, that he was really cautious about this because of the race element.
yeah,
It took ages for him to actually write about it for that reason.
yeah,
He's still nervous about it, right? So
yeah.
he says himself that this was really difficult to report on in a way that
Yeah,
other
because
things
it's
aren't.
icky. Because it's icky, and you can see people like thinking that in their head. Even in the conversation we're having now, like, I think there's still the impulse that comes where you kind of want to go like, well, of course, some things were done, or some things like I don't think in any other case of massive child sexual abuse, we would be constantly like adding these kind of addendums. Like people would feel the need to constantly say, and obviously it's more complicated than, and obviously, like, do people do that about the Catholic Church? Like, no, they really didn't,
And
unless you
actually,
were like,
there was also
yeah,
a lot of Catholic soul searching.
yeah.
Lots of, I
Well,
remember.
there was an actual like of the community of people,
Yeah.
like there was, and the problem, again, barring a very small group of whistleblowers, brave as they are, there was the opposite of soul searching. There was a
Mm,
hardening of perspectives. One of the horrible things about reading through these cases is of family members in courts saying "I love you, Dad," or like abusing the victims in the street and calling them white slags. These
mm,
child rape victims. So you have that on like the localized level, and then on the national level, you have people immediately trying to turn this into an issue of the far right,
mm,
immediately trying to downplay the racial issue, or possibly like the most egregious, immediately trying to say that actually white people commit child sexual abuses too. So let's not talk about this one. Because you're just as culpable. Now, I literally cannot think of like in any other instance this would be rightly called out for what it is, which is like deflecting of blame, trying to create a false equivalence where there is none, refusing to own up to any kind of like collective moral responsibility because it might raise uncomfortable questions. There's been no like humility, not by like the authorities, certainly not by the communities that shielded the perpetrators. Like,
mm,
look at even at the sentences. Like, okay, yeah, these guys were, a lot of the perpetrators were tried. Some of these guys went to jail for like 2 years. Okay,
mm,
like so the ones who committed serious acts of rape, some of them went to jail for 8 years. I'm sorry, that is not justice seen to be done to me, and you don't get to sweep that under the rug and say it's been reported on and they went to jail. Why are you bringing it up? Because it's not done. It's still a live issue. There has not been justice for the victims, and there is certainly no justice for future victims if there is not a serious reckoning. I just, yeah,
but it's really hard to see how that reckoning could occur in the current circumstances.
yeah. I don't like, again, it's not possible for the government to even do an inquiry. Like
Yeah.
that, even an inquiry, which, like, as we've kind of spoken about, all the problems that might come up from that, that's too difficult for them. So we're
Mm,
probably moving towards like a much worse situation where like there is just a continued official silence,
mm,
which is like kind of running parallel with an increasingly boldened group of people who now feel they can outright kind of deny the grooming gangs and create the alternative narratives.
mm,
There are some people on Twitter that, like, before this Elon Musk started tweeting about it, noticed that the Wikipedia page for the grooming gangs, the title had been changed by like one like total nut job on Wikipedia to the moral panic, like the grooming gang moral
mm,
panic of the United
mm,
Kingdom. Now you could say that that's just one isolated, like, crazy person. But actually, if you look at the Home Office report and you look at where the research came from, the Home Office report, and people who have been going on the news and talking about it who weren't directly involved, presenting themselves as neutral academics. In recent years, there have been more people who have been pretty comfortable to stand up and say, actually, there's no ethnic component to this whatsoever. They will
mm,
never bring up the racial abuse of the white victims, ever. They will certainly never bring up the fact that authorities felt they couldn't act because they were afraid of being seen as racist. So people now feel comfortable to say that sort of stuff publicly and feel that they won't like face any reprisal for that. I don't think that was true even 10 years ago. So I just think, again, like so many other things in society, you're going to get one group of people who are polarized in one direction, who are like, this is an atrocity, this is a horror, this totally like delegitimizes the like foundation for the modern British state. It's entirely rotten. I don't care about it. Like, get rid of it. It's disgusting. And you get people on the other side who like are now denying atrocities because it's like politically inconvenient to accept it, or they see it as like a battering ram to like kind of hit at like other groups in society that they don't like, or just naked self-interest. And then you have like this like kind of impotent government on top, its head kind of swiveling from side to side, going like, oh god, like what do I do, like which group do I want to piss off today, like, you know, oh, I just hope it goes away, like head in the sand, let's just hope people stop talking about it. And it's like, yeah, I mean, I don't know like how this energy will necessarily be directed. I think there is like campaigning work that can and should be done on like stuff like getting a national grooming gang memorial like installed in towns. I think like trying to push for it to be in the curriculum. Like I don't think it will get done, but it's a way of like keeping that pressure on so this doesn't get like forgotten or swept under the rug is important. Even if that means there's going to be more arguments, even if that means there's going to be more polarization, because the alternative of silence in the face of child abuse is just like unconscionable.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.